The Chronomancer and Creation's End, Destiny of the Void Triangle, Book 3. Written by Jason Harrington. Narrated by Mason Jesse Hamilton. For all the readers who have come to this story, the dark adventure is not yet done. But I savor every moment I get to share this world with you. Prologue. Soulless Lauren did not think his wind-based skills as an aeromancer were a good fit here. The mounds of rubble from the hall were better reused by a geomancer, and there were 10 of them at work in the halls of the abandoned citadel. All he was able to do was supervise from the wreckage of the foyer. True, Lauren was comfortable in the mid-autumn summer breeze, but this was boring. If a pile of stone became too large, Lauren could quicken the vibration of the stone until it slowly became raw energy. That skill was as simple to him as it would be for most other Souluses. But the Torch and Soulless Geomancers were much more at home in this salvage endeavor. They were attuned to the shifts in the stone that indicated buried objects of varied personal value. They were at home in the heaps of marble, flecked with burns. Lauren could go into the halls, produce his focus hawk feather, and shape spells of earth, but it would be slow. He would only get in the way. Irritations would flare for it, and there would be conflict. It was to be expected. No one really wanted to come here. The summer saw the end of the Kassaran onslaught, a genocidal effort from the greater continent to wipe out every man, woman, and child in Stratia. This season, the wounds from the war were still fresh and grating. Lauren looked up to the light gray blanket of overcast skies and sighed. Though the Order of the Enlightened Sun was more wounded now than after the Battle of Catan, they needed to stand and show strength. Lauren sighed as he walked to the edge of the entry. He looked to the blackened heap that was once the harbor city of Catan. He remembered when it was once a vast city of dark stone and vibrant colors. There used to be dozens of ships moored at the stone port, while hundreds more waited at the sea with bright sails snapping at the wind. There were smells of bakeries, perfumes, and fish filling the air, while garishly dressed men and women looked in the streets with the colors of rainbow. The sound of bursting commerce, roaring waves and soaring gulls filled the air with a wondrous vitality. Through it all, the white sunburst-shaped Zenith Citadel stood on top of the rise. It never loomed, only cradled protectively. Now the black burned ruins of the city were closed with an impassable barrier, created as a dying act of the greatest leaders of the Order. Lauren turned his wide blue eyes back to the remains of the Citadel. The mournful cries of the gulls chased him, accompanied by the melancholy sigh of the waves. At least the blackened bodies and staked heads were laid to proper rest in the earth several miles away. The names of the dead in Catan, and those who died fighting in the Citadel against the Kassarans, were etched into a steel monolith overlooking the burial ground. All that was left here was sad, hollow ruins. For any light of the Order who survived, coming here was a reopened wound. Lauren brushed and tousled sandy-colored hair before pulling up the deep hood of his gray robe. He grabbed his bamboo staff and chanted for stronger durability, just as a great boom sounded. The ground at his feet trembled, and a giant dust cloud enveloped the open foyer. "All is well!" came a disarming muffled shout. "I misread the stone of the crater!" Lauren sighed again, shaking his head as he approached the smooth decline in the foyer. It was the exact place where Solus Baran, the strange pyromancer, dissolved into the endless current to slow the advance of the Kassarans. Dissolving happened because of gathering more endless current than you could tolerate, and it was far more explosive than it sounded. He left no body to bury, but his name would not be soon forgotten. Lauren peered down into the rim. At the bottom of the hole, even with the floor of the basement, there was a new opening that fell into darkness. He brushed away errant clouds of dust to be certain of what he saw, but it was a hole that led to the basement. Lauren descended, his steps mindful and tentative, until he could lean over the hole for a better view. "Are you injured, Light Jolton?" Lauren shouted to the dark-haired Kitani Torch. The heavy-set, gray-robed figure appeared in the light pouring in from above. He looked at Lauren with comical, weary gray eyes. "Only my pride as a geomancer, Light Lauren." Lauren restrained a chuckle at the silly observation of pride in falling. "I can't see anything down here, but I don't understand how I missed such an obvious gap in the earth." "Feel no shame, Light Jolton. All our geomancers have passed this way and felt nothing." Lauren gave his reassurance as he clasped his brown and white feather. With a mumbled word, winds gathered around him and lifted him off the ground. He slowly descended into the dark opening. The grasping winds released Lauren 10 feet below the basement. He looked around, but the darkness was thick and implacable, revealing nothing beyond the small circle of light. "What is this place?" Jolton's voice was quiet and tentative, but it filled the cavernous surroundings. Lauren shook his head, squinting and widening his eyes. "I don't know," he breathed. "I don't think any living light knows about this place." "Shall I get the other solars?" Jolton asked. Lauren nodded as he lowered the point of his staff close and slowed his breathing. He calmed his thoughts while Jolton conjured a pillar of stone to lift him through the opening. Lauren remained in the mysterious darkness, but the rush of endless current filled him with tranquility within. The vibrations of all things in life flowed through his will, eager for direction and shape. It was not much. He waved the feather over the top of his staff, mumbled a few words, and a fist-sized ball of white light flared an inch above the bamboo. It was enough to break the gloom. Lauren gave a startled cry and nearly jumped out of his skin at the sight of the iron behemoth standing before him. It was a moment more, and a dim flicker of his light before Lauren realized the giant was not going to move. Though the hall was 10 feet tall and wide enough for several people side by side, the metal statue left little space to maneuver around. Also, there was a faint hum of enchanting current in the iron figure. It was not enough to give it function, but Lauren knew it must have animated it long ago. Lauren circled the dormant guardian warily, feeling small and irrelevant as he passed under one powerful arm. The hum of magic followed him like a pair of watchful eyes from within the hollow metal. If the magic still thrived, would that arm crush him down flat? But Lauren passed the metal watchman without event. He took a measure of the air as he left it behind. It was mostly stale and dry, but there was an unpleasant mix as well. There was the smell of tangled roots and hard clay, coupled with the sharp reek of rusted iron. There was also the lingering residual stench of urine, feces, and blood. Lauren investigated the area in his light and walked forward. Dust covered the stone floor in a decade-old thin layer. There were rows of iron doors on either side, which were closed and latched steel shutters at eye level and foot level. There were wrought iron torch sconces set in the walls at intervals. They left large, greasy black stains on the nearby walls and ceilings, but the brands themselves were gone. There were a number more of the giants spread throughout the halls. Some were more of the visor helmet iron guards, while others were a mix of soil and roots, held together by the last faint magic. Neither held any facial features. They must have been made solely for their function. The minutes passed, and Lauren's footfalls continued to echo into the silence of the hall. His eyes probed into fathomless dark, trying to discern an end or destination. The level must have to run from one end of the Zenith Citadel to the other. Out of overwhelming curiosity, Lauren paused before one of the many hundreds of iron doors. He tried to open the door, but it was rusted to its frames and warped from the passing of years. It would not budge a hair's width. There were any number of spell shapes that would have circumvented the sealed door, but simplicity seemed a better fit here. He would try the shutter at eye level. Though calling it eye level was generous from Lauren. As was true from most men from Votus, Lauren was shorter, standing well below average. The latch was uncomfortably located above his head, and his shoulders strained against the shrieking metal. He hopped and pulled himself up for a better view. It was hard to make out the details with only the light at the end of his staff. The room was cramped with a low ceiling. A mixed stench of rot seeped out of the opening and caused Lauren to cough in revulsion. A mass of moth-eaten burlap barely contained quills of straw, looking like a sleeping porcupine. But a smaller, crude wool blanket revealed it to be a less than inviting bed. There was an old wooden bucket at the far corner of the room. Lauren realized that he was looking at a cell. He closed the shutter and opened another, several doors further away. The bed looked a little more comfortable, but it was still another cell. Lauren hastily moved from one door to the next. His ears rang with repeated bursts of screaming metal. With each chamber varied only slightly with offered comfort, each room was another dark cell. Lauren hyperventilated, his eyes wide. How did this sprawling dark secret persist without anyone knowing? What was the intention of this place? There was a flood of other questions cascading into the young Solus's mind. But there was something else. Deep in the darkness, a familiar magic pulse with a faint invitation. Lauren walked forward, following the hum in the stale, windless air. His light reached into the worn and dusty stone. Though this was a dark and horrible place, excitement bubbled in his bowels. A secret would be revealed. He didn't know what it would be, but it felt monumental. At what must have been beneath the far west wall of the citadel, the hallway ended. The endless current pulsed against the front of his body. The source of the magic was clearly the unremarkable wall directly in front of him. Not all was what it seemed. Lauren reached to touch the cold stone. He was rewarded with a sharp sting that flared from his palms up into his forearm. He pulled back, shaking the pain out of his arm, while he winced in a hiss. Lauren was not meant to see this mystery, but he knew why this felt familiar. As an Aeromancer, he could recognize the personal signature of another Aeromancer's wind sorcery. This had the distinct feel of Light Meryl's magic. Maral was elevated to the status of Dawn Light after the Kassaran invasion. It meant he was the interim leader of the Order of the Enlightened Sun. Lauren knew Maral well. Had the Pirali Aeromancer been raised to Solus only a few years earlier, he would have been Lauren's spark, his teacher. Regardless, Maral was like an older brother to Lauren. The senior Aeromancer often joined into Lauren's training to impart refined techniques and knowledge. Maral was not only a dedicated archivist, an enthusiast historian, but he possessed a solid moral nature. This created a magnetic charisma for the tall Solus. Something like this would have left an indelible mark on Maral. His mind would have been plagued by the negative ramifications of its very existence. So there was no way Maral had ever been here. Lauren surmised that the signature waited for Maral before anything more would be revealed. Then an epiphone struck Lauren and he gasped. His bamboo staff rattled before he realized his hands were shaking with excitement. He knew what this must be. Lauren took a deep breath, calming his jittery nerves. Maral had to know about this, right away. The ability to guide the Order into the future would be augmented by this. Without a doubt, the wall was a secret opening into the vault of the Grand Illumination. The last light to see this chamber was Elysian. Now, it waited for Light Maral.
Part 1. 2 years later. Chapter 1. Ryland stood in the smooth marble chamber. He tried not to blink his brilliant blue eyes. His gray torch robe was open and loose, revealing a whip-quick 6-foot man wearing a blue farmer's tunic and brown pants. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his feet were apart, even with his broad shoulders. A single head-sized current sphere floated high over the center of the room, casting its bright white light onto his long, raven-black hair. He forced his hard, dark complexions and angled face to remain expressionless. Ryland kept his minds and thoughts blank and open. In front of him, the tall, wiry Pirali Maral stood equally still. Maral's narrow face, gray eyes, and fair-skinned complexion was dispassionate and unblinking as he looked at Rylan in silence. His whitewood staff leaned against the corner behind him. Only 2 years ago, the soulless Aeromancer voluntarily abandoned his staff and robe, as well as his place in the Order. After being reinstated, he had the odd quirk of seldom being without his staff. Rylan quieted a sympathetic thought from Maral. The Dawn Light placed little stock in anything that was not a book, but the Parali was honoring the memory of a friend who died in battle during the invasion. Maral's mouth was poised to speak a reprimand, but Rylan was quick to quiet his thoughts. This was not the place to fail the trial. The real challenge was yet to come. Rylan continued to remain as patient as he was unmoving. This part of the Trial of Solace was created to test the torch in 2 ways. It was meant to test the light's patience and clarity, while allowing a knowledgeable Lear to peer into his mind. They would determine if a torch possessed all the required lore, and if they could recall what they needed with ease. Without any further warning, Maral turned and backed away. Rylan was free to exit through the red oak door. Another test would wait for Rylan on the other side. It seemed improper to every light that Maral should be an overseer for any of the tests. He was the Dawn Light, and while that was not the same as Grand Illumination, everyone believed this task should not have been his. But Maral won out. He was the most well-versed light for now. His knowledge was growing from part of the Grand Illumination's vault. He was training several torches to be archivists, but that was a work in progress. The next chamber was cavernous and much longer than it was wide. The spacious room required several current spheres for lighting, and it was divided in half. The first half was a stairwell that led to a pool of water. Rylan knew from experience that those depths were kept purposefully frigid. The air on the other side of the pool wavered with intense heat. That half was a pit with standing steel posts that led to the other side and the exit door. This chamber was called the Trial of Endurance. Take off your boots and remain under the surface without moving. The curvy red-haired hydromancer Pora stood on a high platform in the center of the chamber. She stood with one hand clasping a birch staff. The young woman from Narranmore looked at Rylan with an unreadable expression. Rylan took off his brown hide boots and calmed his thoughts in one deep breath. The endless current filled him but caused a dull pang in his bowels like a blow to the gut. Through his bond with Imrine Tekere, many hundreds of miles away, he felt her double over from the sudden pain. A warning thought would have been welcome, dear husband. Imrine's thoughts came to his mind with sarcasm. Rylan didn't respond. His thoughts were blank, even as he stepped into the icy pool. But repressed memories would not allow him to remain clear. A twitch threatened to jolt him as his lower back seared with phantom pain. His mind flashed not with images of the pool or the trials of a Solus. Again, Rylan knelt in the frigid snows in the Arctic. Again, his powers were stripped away. Again, he was helpless as the red-clad giant walked away. No, Rylan, come to! That moment is long past! Imrine shouted into Rylan's mind before the thrashing could begin. Rylan projected his gratitude and silenced all his thoughts. His mind grasped the sound of his heartbeat, gripped the drumbeat of blood pulsing in his veins. His body created innate vibrations in the water, and he slowed them. His awareness stretched into the water. On the surface, he smoothed the ripples like wrinkles in fabric, and the water became placid. Pora's words filled the silence of his mind. Move through the water without using your arms and legs. Climb onto the wall without disturbing the water. Rylan mentally redirected his own vibrations in the water. He funneled the projected force behind his feet, propelling him forward. He created a barrier of energy around him to nullify the force of his movement. When Rylan reached the other side, he redirected the vibrations to push his body upright. The next few moments were difficult as he directed himself above the surface without causing a ripple. Consciously moving the moisture in his clothes and on his body was more painstaking. His mind tensed and strained with the precise concentration. It would have been easier to lift a boulder his own size with his bare hands. But a Solus needed to display unwavering focus and the ability to control themselves and their immediate environment. Inch by inch, Rylan emerged from the water until he stepped onto the stone wall. The second half of the trial was a series of raised, narrow steel pedestals. Rylan would have to step slow, wait until he was given a cue to step, and keep his boots in his hands. Also, the pedestals were intensely heated by a furnace below a metal grate, 20 feet below. Marine remained quiet, but Rylan felt her tense with anxiety. While this was not the most difficult part of the trials, it still put her on edge every time he performed it. This was a demonstration of a Solus's ability to withstand the elements without effort. Rylan pushed the endless current into his feet and took the first step. He shoved back against another horrific memory. It came as he thought on how alike his efforts were to Xenon roles, seeming impervious to the elemental attack. Many Solus died against him for that revelation alone. Rylan shook away the memory. Xenon Roll died 2 years ago. It was wasteful to dwell on him now. He stood still, both feet planted on the flat, hot metal. Pora wrapped the butt of her staff against the platform, and Rylan stepped to the next pedestal. He pushed the endless current into his feet to keep them from burning. Any rising smoke would be a failure for him. This continued for 12 more steps, and Rylan passed the pit after an hour. He opened the red oak door and entered for the final task of his trial. In the next room, he had already failed 3 previous attempts, leaving the entire order baffled. The next marble room was much larger than the last. It was a small amphitheater. Its ascending tiers were empty. They climbed to a breezy landing where the walls were only columned balconies to the outside, allowing sunshine to pour through. In the center of the low round room, there was a long rectangular stone table. On one side, occupying several of the tall-backed stone chairs, was the fledgling Order of Solus. There were 12 chairs in all, but only 6 were occupied. Pora and Moral meld-walked at the end of their trial, so it was no surprise to see them seated before Rylan. Ishel and Borvis sat to one side of the dawn light. The usually jovial Tyrillian steepled his hands and rested his chin on them. He eyed Rylan with stern scrutiny. The soulless Polymancer never kept his distrust of Rylan a secret, but Rylan believed in his wary, objective view. The lanky man, almost the same age as Rylan, would make an ideal husband to Ishel, Rylan's childhood friend. Ishel sat back, relaxed with her arms folded. Her hazel eyes looked at Rylan with unspoken expectation. Her tan complexion creased, and her small mouth furrowed with faint consternation. She let her golden brown hair fall to her shoulders, as she had as far back as he remembered. Since Ishel began training for the mantle of the Grand Illumination, Moral would no longer permit her to wear her favorite worn brown blacksmith dress and apron. She wore her gray robe open over a violet tunic and black-dyed trousers. A silver 5-pointed star in a gold circle dangled from her neck. Her staff, a black cast-iron rod topped with a pearl shaped as a lightning bolt, floated upright behind her. An older woman, wearing a red tunic and white trousers under a gray robe, stood up from the table. She was taller than most women of the Order, with brown, piercing eyes and aged creases in her dark ivory complexion. She circled the table in a stride that conveyed fierce certainty and resolve. Age was not a common sign to the lights of the Order. Often, gray streaks and wrinkles only started after 70 years alive. The endless current augmented its practitioners with better longevity, but Solus Terranin was recruited by Solus Baran very late in her life. Terranin's silver-streaked dark brown hair fell over her face as she bent to pick up her ash wood staff, and a plain hourglass filled with silver dust. Her hands were marked up to her forearms with a webwork of raised, thick scars from frostburns. She acquired those scars many years ago, before discovering her powers. Even though the Order had offered to heal them many times early in her training, she vehemently refused. Everyone understood now they were a mark of the losses she endured to become who she was now. Terranin didn't speak her expectations of Rylan. She turned the heavy hourglass over the stone table. She stood in front of him, unblinking and still. Ryland braced himself before calming his thoughts. This chamber and trial were the part that failed him 3 times. He understood why he was failing, but the entire order was baffled, and he couldn't tell them what was really happening. As Ryland projected the endless current, his eyes ached with dull throbs. His scalp itched uncomfortably and his throat dried. All of this struck him, sudden and total. He concentrated, pushing his mind into Terranen's vibrations in the endless current. Her emotions and senses came easily. The emotions of the human body caused different speeds in blood flow, and different internal alchemies. These caused different vibrations in the air. But reaching for emotions was only part of the current reading. The Trial of Solace had been altered in the last 2 years to accommodate this knowledge. Passing through current reading required more precision. Ryland connected with the vibration caused by Terranen's emotions. He embraced her impatience and concern, even as she placed walls of indifference to stop him. Her clarity in the endless current was greater than his own, and the empathy chafed on the inside of his head. He buried the pain further into his awareness so that he could fall deeper into Terranen's vibrations. Terranen's thoughts were just beyond the intensity of her feelings. The place of human thought was far more ephemeral, creating unique vibrations that could only be reached through empathy. Images filled Ryland's mind, along with growing aches towards his ears. Naturally, the first image was a fire, a tiny candle flame flickering resiliently in the breeze. Ryland held up his index finger and shaped the endless current into the exact dancing fire, struggling at the tip of his finger. The image changed in Ryland's mind, and he matched the shape of it. A wind current snuffed the flame before cooling into a fist-sized ball of water. The water cooled in a sphere of ice before darkening into a glossy obsidian stone. The images came quicker, and Ryland was pushed to his limit to alter the vibrations of the object in his hand. Evocation and polymancy shifted randomly. In one instant, he would shape a ceramic pitcher of water, only to change it into a crackling ball of blinding electricity in the next. As much as the current reading and spell shaping burned him, Ryland kept far better pace than he did in the previous trials. Terranen tested Ryland in a new and surprising way. A ball of delicate glass fell to the floor from her hand. He needed to halt its impact. Ryland quickly reached beyond the endless current, finding the comfortable linear patterns of the temporal current, the universal essence of time. His reflexes were just quick enough to cover the ball of glass in a stasis sphere, just as it touched the ground. Caught in timelessness, the glass sphere remained intact. A tiny bead of sweat tickled Ryland's forehead, just as Terranen's images momentarily halted. He breathed deep and slow, calming his nerves for the final task of the trial. There was far more silver dust in the hourglass than his previous attempts, and the pain in his head was only a quarter of what he endured before. The first image was an arid flatland full of scrub, cactus, and sage far to the south of the Six Nations. It was on top of a low rise at the heart of the unclaimed southern peninsula. Shaping the Meldwalk with his mouth and hands would not be allowed. He would have to perform it with his thoughts. Ryland braced himself for the raw, searing pain that would overtake him when he became one with the endless current. The vibrations within and around his body quickened as the current started to claim him. His skin burned with the sensation of being peeled, and he fought the impulse to scream. The stinging anguish burned deeper, like a countless barrage of needles piercing muscle and bone. The world blurred like a wet, bleeding painting. It was impossible to determine if he was indoors or out, and what he might have passed through. Ryland struggled to grip his concentration with iron resolve, even as pain and Madman's visions encroached on him. The world lurched forward and settled exactly where Ryland intended. It was the exact place from Terranen's mind. A stray length of sky blue cloth was caught in a patch of scrub, stirred and whipping in the desert wind. Ryland retrieved the cloth and closed his eyes. He projected his awareness into the altered vibrations of the fabric. Terranen's pyromancy signature pulsed with faint warmth. His mind drifted into its invitation. Terranen's energy filled Ryland's mind with an image. A crude wooden dock sat at the end of a small beach village far to the east. It was a place of huts made of long grass and lengths of bamboo. Luckily, the tiny village was of no interest to the Kassaran Empire, or he would have to evade the notice of Karak's swordsmen, the main infantry and overall law enforcers of the Empire. Ryland braced himself for the heated pain and Meld walked again. The dusty desert quickly gave way to the depthless blue and giant rolling waves of the Maelstrom Sea. As pure energy, he ascended and fell along the surface of the ocean, as intangible as wind. The sun quickly found its way behind his back as he continued east, but it was all a blur, too hurried and blended to mentally absorb. When Ryland halted at the western edge of the village, he gasped. He braced his hands against his knees while sweat slicked his forehead. He watched the droplets fall from his chin into the white beach sands. The pain that grated inside his body heavily taxed his will. Ryland's endurance and stamina were tested without reprieve. There was little time left to complete this Meldwalk, find the object, and return to the Arc-like compound. He stuffed his hands into his pockets and tried to appear as nonchalant and inconspicuous as he could feign to be, a task made difficult as a Stratian so close to the Empire. Though Ryland could blend into such crowds with more ease than most, before the Cassarans invaded, he worked among the people of the islands. He paid money for items from merchants of the main continent. He knew a little bit more about the Crimson Empire than his fellow Lights. He could speak the language, and he was familiar with their mannerisms. Ryland closed his eyes and pushed the endless current out through his fingertips. His hands burned for it, but strands of magic searched the village for the hidden signature of energy. He found it in less than a minute, and found it was Solus Neralise that left the strip of blue cloth this time. The red-haired Aeromancer left it tied to one of the support posts underneath the pier. A fishing boat was on its way to tie its mooring lines. The small oar boat was only 30 feet from the end of the harbor. If he tried to collect the cloth by hand, he would rudely obstruct their work. It was no coincidence that the Aeromancer placed this trial. Ryland was expected to shape a precise and intricate series of grasping winds to untie and collect the final piece of this trial. Ryland pushed the endless current through a series of whistles and breathy words. His hands spun dozens of spirals and sharp snaps. A gust of concentrated breeze sliced an unerring path. It met the cloth as one of the 5 dark-skinned islanders jumped to the wooden planks with coiled rope in hand. It was difficult to concentrate wind to form the minute pressures of hands and fingers. Ryland often found it easier to lift into the sky in a broad funnel of wind than it was to concentrate moving air into a confined space. All at once, the curved dagger sliced the back of his thigh as it returned to Xenonroll's grip.
No, love. Return to the moment. You are so nearly through this trial.
Imrine's voice filled Ryland's mind, and he shook himself free of the flashback. Ryland changed his focus and intentions, shifting from using the grasping winds to untie the strips of cloth, to a raw extension of inner will to pull it towards him. The docking fisherman gave the cloth and Ryland a surprised glance as the strip of blue cloth whipped through the air. Ryland grabbed the cloth in a quick snap before Meldwalking back to the compound. When Ryland returned to the white marble amphitheater, the sun was much higher and brighter than the tropical village. It wasn't the first time that Ryland reminded himself that the east was always hours ahead of the west. Terranin stood patiently before him. Ryland placed the blue strips of cloth into her scarred hands. She gave him a yellow strip of cloth and offered him a warm and knowing smile. The older Pyromaster gave him no other encouragement, but as he looked to the hourglass, he caught her meaning. There was much more silver dust in the top half than there had been at this same time in his previous failed trials.
Chapter 2. When Ryland staggered out of the Hall of Trials, it was into the cool, fresh breeze of night. Current spheres cast a bright white glow on the long outdoor paths from within tall iron lamp poles. Ryland was completely exhausted in every way. He began a clumsy shuffle, his feet dragging against the white cobbled pathway. It was slow, and he often lurched into the grasses. Night owls hooted from the treetops in the dense woods, far beyond the perimeter. Though Ryland returned to Terranin with the 2 strips of blue cloth, the yellow cloth was a signal that he was not yet done. He was sent out into Provis twice more, to find 6 more colorful strips of colored cloth. Before each departure, a different Council Solus tested him on a different spell shape. Then, he had to chase their individual current signatures. Borvis was the most grueling of the trial judges, for obvious reasons. His tests of shapes were twice as long, and he deferred to Moral for a test of different chronomancy spells. The door to the hall opened and closed behind Rylan before Ishel called to him.
Light Rylan, a moment please.
Rylan turned, and Ishel offered him a familiar emerald displacement staff. He accepted it, allowing a moment to marvel at its sparkling transparent green shine, and the luster of the gold shapes and numbers etched into the ends. He leaned against it, partially to relieve his weary body, but also fondly. He crafted the tool, despite order regulations, to aid him in the war with the Cassarans. 2 years ago he was separated from it at the end of the war. Until now, he rightfully earned it back into his possession. Ishel smiled, brief and understanding, before her expression changed.
I wanted to speak with you. Alone.
Rylan nodded, locating a white granite bench several yards away along the path. He inclined his head in invitation. Ishel exhaled wearily as she sat down next to Rylan. Her list of responsibilities tripled after the war. She studied and practiced any hour she was not with Moral. Her studies for Solus occupied the first 6 months after the war, preparing her for the trial. But Moral wasted no moment in teaching her statecraft, national protocol and economics, and diplomatic strategy. Now Ishel was almost ready to assume the mantle of the new Grand Illumination, but Rylan watched as her fatigue became as great as her newfound duties.
We all expected you to take it back so much sooner.
Ishel spoke with a bluntness that struggled with an obvious reluctance. Rylan nodded, looking down at his cobbles and staff. I know. Ishel shook her head with a low chuckle.
Not really, you don't. If you failed today, the council was going to decide whether you would be a lesser Solus. It was a matter of decision, even though it would have been a waste of such skill and potential on so many levels.
Rylan took that in. If he were a lesser Solus, he would only be permitted to wield meldwalking, current reading, and domestic polymancy. He would be forbidden to wield the arts he trained in for 6 years. Where would you stand in that debate, Light Ishel? Rylan asked warily. Ishel raised her voice a little with frustration.
I would have concurred. Fates, Light Rylan! You're supposed to be the most powerful sorcerer in the world. I passed my trial in 6 months. 6 months, Light Rylan!
By now, Ishel was shouting, her voice filled with incredulity.
There were candles who wagered you would pass your trial a month after the war. We all knew you were gravely wounded in your battle with Xenon, but our reports of him suggested he could not leave you so damaged for so long.
Ishel turned and looked at Rylan with sad and desperate eyes.
Why, Light Rylan? Why was it so much for you?
Ishel asked gently. Not for the first time, Rylan wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to share the knowledge of what it cost him to promise Stratia's survival. She was his best friend and closest ally in the Order. He wanted to believe she would not judge him too harshly. She would help him with a solution, just as she always did. Rylan looked around the Arc-Light compound, the new home of the Order of the Enlightened Sun. It was built in the Geomancy restored woods, at the border of Peral Sen and Khatan Shah. The southernmost structure was only a mile away from the plains where King Delkit Mazeneth fell in a duel against Xenon Roll. The compound was built without walls as a message to Provis. The Order would be a part of Stratia, open and accepting, sharing in the fate of the people. Rylan wanted to be that way for Ishel, but his burden was too horrific to share. It already pained him deeply that the love of his life had to face this as well. Rylan sighed. I just need to go home, Light Ishel. I joined the Order for one reason. Now I am ready to fulfill my purpose. I can help our people, and I will grow stronger as I do. Just as Light Moral said, I was able to pass the test because of helping Light Borvis build the docks and warehouses in New Khatan. Ishel nodded while she looked wistfully into the shadowy forest.
You'll not be alone in Malkinor for long. We are gathering for a summit with the rulers in 2 weeks. I am going to propose the chapter houses for each nation. Rylan was dubious at that, suggesting and achieving could be very different. Do you believe they will accept the presence in their nations? A lot of people witnessed a void hand. The ancient mistrust must be stronger than ever. Isho gave Rylan a look of weighted surprise. I am only just learning of the source of that. Most of the time, only Solus speak of it. How did you know of it? I wasn't always my own sparklight, Isho. Sparkulician shared as much knowledge as he could. It wasn't a complete lie, but it was not Ulyssean who taught him this. In any case, this is only part of it. Malaric will accept our proposal, and I think I can convince Talik. But we were only allowed to build a new house here because it is an unclaimed land on the border. Isho sighed and shook her head. There's so much to do, and not enough people in Stratia to do it all. New families are being made, Light Isho, Rylan assured her. Children are born. It all takes time. Isho looked like she was about to add Rylan's placations when she pointed a hardened glare on him. Stop changing the subject. My point is that you will not be alone. You've never been, though you battle so much for it on the otherwise. That is why I speak to you now. Why all of that has happened. I worry about you. I never have a chance to say as much anymore, but I have been watching you since the end of the war. You are more distant than ever. I can see the struggle in your eyes every day, and it only grows worse. Your skills are not as they were, even while your chronomancy remains the same. Isho paused to draw Rylan into her worried hazel stare. And you rarely sleep in your bed here. Do you fold step to Imrine so often? Or is it something else? The last was the hardest secret to keep, and Rylan hated that Imrine had to experience it as he did. The nightly horrors, the dreams. He didn't want anyone else to be a part of it. The silence stretched, and Isho's deep breath was a sigh that she would change the subject. It became too heavy to continue just now. Someone needed to come and congratulate you on your long-awaited triumph. Rylan smiled. Thank you. Isho's expression lightened. So then, will you go back? What will you do first? I will stay another day to offer farewells and collect some expert tomes. I must admit, I was surprised on two fronts. I did not know Light Moral read so much of the Golden Hourglass lore. He was astonishingly ready to supervise your test of your skill level. I was also surprised that your chronomancy could be measured as a high expert. There was much elemental infusion, and with such nuance that I thought you would fail. Rylan remembered the surprising test from Moral. Though no other light could shape the temporal current, the interim leader read so much and retained so much knowledge that he was prepared to reinstate ancient tests not seen in 7 millennia. The basics were simple enough. A displacement sphere on a piece of iron, sealed with water and air to hasten its natural rusting, a temporal projection to discover the activities of various flame-level lights over a month ago. Then Moral tested his fold step and stasis field. A fold step to Votus was performed to leave an hourglass. He shaped a stasis field when the first grain was in mid-fall. Then, Ryland fold stepped back to the compound to fold step Moral to the top of the dusty rise, where the winds were still. But the last test was the most challenging. Moral produced a potted wilted orchid. Ryland had 5 minutes to restore the dying lavender-colored flower. Were chronomancers truly required to synthesize different forms of sunlight and distill it that way? Ishel asked with a chuckle of disbelief. That is why I chose this path, Light Ishel. Think of the people and their labors. Whatever they wish to grow may be ready for harvest overnight. Homes can be rebuilt and improved in minutes. Ryland sounded so excited that it caused Ishel to laugh heartily in the quiet night. That is always what it has been for you, Light Ryland, and it makes me so glad to hear the outskirts boy I always knew. You were always giving your greatest efforts to make life easier and happier for everyone. Ryland cleared his throat and blushed at the compliment. But to answer your question, Amreen and I will have a home in the East Mountains. Rylan knew he didn't need to explain the distance. Too many people believed they saw his shape in the Hellfire glow during the eclipse. I will help Amreen with the healers during the day, but at night, I will help by starting to rebuild and improve Borquet. Right now, they only have a makeshift barrack for a squad of the Phoenix Legion. Many of the homes and shops need to be rebuilt. Isho raised an astonished eyebrow. You give yourself a tall order. And what of you, your soon-to-be Radiance? Rylan gave Ishel a playful nudge. Chapter house, more harbor cities in the east and west, advisors, specialty detachments to assist the people, and you are reading histories that have never been made public. You were trying to make Stratia stronger than it has been for more than 2 millennia. And I will be marrying Lyborvis Len in 2 weeks. You had better make yourself an Amreen present. Ishel shoved back, teasing and demanding. Rylan held up his hands in surrender. We would be there. Perish the thought that it would be otherwise. Ishel's expression brightened. It will be wonderful, Rylan. With the summit a week later, they wish to hold a festival that night. I think my father-in-law simply wants to celebrate because there is no chance of carousing for his son in the future. Rylan laughed, and Ishel joined him before leaning on him. We have come so far, Rylan. Ishel marveled with a wistful nostalgia that was almost melancholy. The son of a starving farmer, and the daughter of a blacksmith impoverished by his sense of honor. Now look at us. We are at the helm of Stratia as it prepares for a golden age. We are both wed to noble-born good people. Though the work is so much, I can't help but feel so glad and hopeful. Rylan remembered words spoken with Ishel before an intense duel of sorcery. It is a brave new world we are walking into. Ishel laughed, remembering those words. Yes, it is. I believe we have been strong enough to make those changes, rather than wait.
Chapter 3. Though the talk with Ishel was good for Rylan, there was no denying he was famished and tired. He could not attend to the latter without first seeing to the former. Rylan's steps on the cobbles were a little surer now. He made his way to the wide single-floor dining hall. The glow of current spheres spilled free from the open windows. Even so late at night, candles and torches would transmute food and clean in shifts. Flames and several of the new candles were still too inexperienced to transmute their own food from the vibrations of the endless current. There were also some, like Rylan, who were too exhausted to do it themselves. Rylan entered and sat at one of the 6 long stone-white tables. His head was down for a moment before a wooden plate slid into view. It held an apple and a thick warm slice of buttered bread. A tall tin cup of cold peach tea came into view not long after. Rylan looked up before picking up the apple and eating it with a ravenous abandon that alarmed him. It was no surprise to see the gray-robed, platinum-haired boy in front of him. Maurice sat, watching Rylan with patient, expressive brown eyes. As he rested his chin on his clasped hands, the young, reed-thin Chronomancer had fair skin and a mouth ready with a warm smile. It made sense that the newly appointed Torch would know exactly what Rylan would find satisfying to eat just then. Even as a candle, Maurice was better acquainted with shapes and techniques better suited for a Solus. His current reading was almost reflexive. I believe congratulations are in order, Light Rylan, Maurice praised as they sat alone. Rylan swallowed a mouthful of apple before speaking. I don't think I'll be alone with the moment for long, Light Maurice. Even Light Moral is beside himself with your rapid progression. Maurice tisked. Do not think to rob yourself of the triumph by flattering me. A Solus at last! It was a place that was meant for you from the very beginning. Rylan smiled, but felt a little ashamed. Maurice joined the Order a year before Rylan. It was common knowledge that the innately wise, powerful, and versatile Chronomancers were born only once a generation or more. There used to be hundreds more of them at a time, governing and guiding Stratia at the Supreme Radiance clan. That changed after the 4 remaining clans were destroyed by the Order of the Void Triangle 2,000 years ago. As the sole living successor to the Path, Rylan always wondered if Elysian should have taken more interest in Maurice. They were both Elumancers after all.
"I'll not have that from you, Light Rylan," Maurice Current read. "If all Stratia, perhaps all Provis, needs time to heal, then who better for this than a Chronomancer?"
It was a perspective Rylan hadn't thought of, but his answering smile was knowing. Now who attempts flattery? Rylan finished the apple and began wolfing through the bread before Maurice continued.
"I just want you to remember how far you've come, and that you've earned this."
There was something about the way Maurice was speaking that felt heavier than the boy himself. It felt as though the words were from someone else. Rylan's eyes watered as he paused eating, and he couldn't understand why.
"No matter what else has transpired, you have made us very proud. You should remember, even as you return to Malkinor, you will never be alone. You can call on any of us to stand with you."
Rylan was speechless, and Maurice stood up, leaving Rylan alone to finish eating. So Rylan ate in thoughtful silence before transmuting the remains of his meal into incorporeal vibrations. Measuring Maurice as an average boy would always be foolhardy to be unwary. No one could safely assess him as a boy any more than they could pin down his precise origins. Whenever he spoke or acted, it was from a place of intentions far too deep for his years. Rylan sighed wearily as he left the dining hall. Maurice was incorrect. As Rylan knew what waited for him, he could already feel the telltale cold forming in the pit of his bowels. He closed his eyes, instantly projecting his awareness into the temporal current, seeking the ruins of the Zenith Citadel. The empty halls outside the dark oak door remained waiting for his return. His temporal study waited for him. The truth was that there were struggles Rylan had to face almost alone. That Amreen Takare had to place her mind, heart, and spirit at risk with him was a prerequisite he hated.
"I will never let you fight alone, my love."
Amreen's iron-hard determination filled his mind.
"This is no fitting gift for my wife," Rylan retorted. "And I will never be so fickle that anything would matter more to me than my love for you."
And it was Amreen's determination to love him that always brought Rylan back to himself. The inner cold deepened, and Rylan hastily shaped the fold step. The empty halls of the Citadel and the quiet grounds of the Arc-Light compound folded over each other. The temporal current brought one to overlap the other, creating a sense of vertigo meant to force Rylan to choose. He will release the cool, soothing night and well-lit paths. He stood in the dark, empty sacred halls the Order of the Enlightened Sun once called home. Rylan spared no moment as he yanked open the door leading to a chamber from a future that no longer existed. Time was short, and he rushed ahead to the far side of the chamber, stepping over the gold inlaid circle. His right index finger traced lines and sigils of yellow and blue light against the wall. The stone and mortar wavered like a mirage and dissolved. He whipped around the open entry, pressing a loose stone until he heard a metallic click. The wall returned into being, and Rylan breathed a loud sigh of relief. A faint gold and green glow slowly filled the room, mingling with eldritch star spots. Green hexagons, triangles, and numerals flared with intense light, marked everywhere in the floors and walls. A single mattress with a blanket and pillow lay close to the wall, disheveled from use. A thick green velvet cushion sat in the center of the room. Golden simulacrum runes cast their glow from the cavernous ceiling, accompanied by several artful Elumancer enchantments. The faint stench of sulfur began to infuse the air with its rancid miasma. There was only a moment before a low, threatening growl sounded in the room without a source. Rylan spun his emerald staff in a cocky, wind-catching flourish as he grinned with the challenge. So, who did they send this time? Another growl reverberated in the dim, glowing room, louder and more insistent. Rylan looked around the room for any sign of demonic strength, but so far, the rancid odor and growling were solitary. The demonic visitations were not as frequent in the first few months after the war, but the children of nothing, the offspring of oblivion that strived for the end of all creation, had reveled in seeing their champion. Ryland became Negistrisis, creation's end during the eclipse that saw the destruction of the entire Kassaran army. But Ryland returned in the aftermath and resisted the machinations of Hell. The rulers of Hell did not accept his refusal. More and more, over the past 2 years, they visited and pushed against his resolve. They came in the early dark hours before dawn, sometimes in the heart of night. In the beginning, they stayed for hours, hurling objects and creating pandemonium all through the night. They were trying to wear down his physical resolve. In time, they learned that a Chronomancer could fight for as long as was needed, and still get all the sleep the body required. Ryland snorted at the weak display that greeted him now. Could they send nothing stronger than a scorched imp? You're better suited to licking the soot off the floor at Fleos. It was dangerous to taunt and provoke the children of nothing, but Ryland knew about the varying levels of strength they displayed. This one was not able to so much as profane the walls. He would not lose sleep tonight, even without the use of chronomancy. But the first step was to know what kind of demon came to Ryland tonight. He discovered early on that if he shaped the displacement cloak or field, he could slow the endless current enough to see the absence in the air they caused. They were beings created from fragments of the void, and their presence in creation was an anomaly. Ryland took it a step further. The first displacement cloak accelerated his speed 6 times over. The pulsing, swirling vibrations of sparkling air in the endless current became slow and perceptible to him. There was a low space close to the ground where a dark, transparent outline repulsed the endless current. Something about the outline suggested it was not a scorch imp. Scorch imps were small, winged black creatures with long, barbed tails and 2 curved horns protruding from the crown on their head. They resided in Fleos, the world of towering endless fires. They were lowly creatures, with limited capacity to think and rise. When they were not at their tendency of eating the soot and ashes that layered the brimstone ground, they were tackling restraining souls so that greater demons could inflict their wrath easier. But a scorched imp at full height stood 4 feet tall. This was something else. Ryland almost attacked with the stasis cloak infused with light and ice. It was the perfect antithesis to the residents of Fleos. Ryland pushed his will into a sigil tracing into the ceiling, and it flared with bright white light. The demon did not cry out as most would have, but the sudden illumination revealed it had no eyes. This demon's body was covered in glossy chitinous plating. In place of legs, it had a long barbed tail ending in a wide aquatic fin. It had 2 thick arms, each ending in 3 long, sharp curved claws, and thick, leathery webbing in between. It crawled on the ground on its belly, but Ryland knew it was accustomed to swimming. Its head only had a long, grinning mouth filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth, and a series of gills below the neck. The demon was a torment swimmer. It was commonly found in the depthless, corrosive seas of Blood and Block Karak, but it was rare for any of them to find their way into Provis. This was because they were much like amphibians or fish. They could not survive outside their bloody abodes for long. Ryland gathered the endless current. His mouth whispered and whistled while his hands twirled and spun. Gusts of wind started as slight breezes and gathered force. The wind quickly became a howling gale that whipped in funnels all around the enclosed room. But as Ryland pushed the endless current into the Illumancer sigils in the ceiling, a sharp pain blasted with insistent ferocity into his nerves. His concentration wavered, and the wind began to die down. Worry began to take hold of Ryland. The long, exhaustive trials taxed him too heavily. It was only a matter of time before his powers as a light came to greater conflict with the residual weakness in his soul. The use of the essence of stillness, the primordial energy of oblivion, left its mark deep in his being. It caused most of his magic to burn him.
Chapter 4. Imreen Teker opened her green eyes early in the dark night. Ryland's feelings of urgency flooded into her. Her nerves seared with lava-hot scouring pain from his efforts to wield his magic. The pain began only an hour ago, nudging against her mind as she slept beneath the crisp sheets and thick blanket. She gasped with each wave of heated agony that assailed her. Imreen closed her eyes, letting images from Ryland's sight fill the darkness in her mind. Her husband, married to her in body and spirit, stood in the brilliantly colorful glow of his new locked chamber. On the ground, crouched low, a vague, shadowy mass growled threateningly. Ryland stood in battle against a demon, and his magic would not respond in his exhaustion and pain. Imreen opened her eyes and flung aside the covers. Her room was illuminated only by a glittering spray of starlight in a blanket of velvet darkness outside her tall bedroom window.
Hold fast, Ryland Teker, and do not yield!
Imreen projected her determined thoughts into the bond of spirit. He gained her last name only because he was born to the lower class and had no surname of his own. Her family had accepted him as one of their own in name as well.
The demon has not won this night yet!
Imreen did not bother to change out of her white silk bedsheet. There wasn't enough time. She circled her bed to an end table and struck a match, lighting a wide white candle in a brass dish. She snuffed the match and quickly grabbed her sheathed steel saber, leaning against her bed. She cast aside the scabbard after a high metallic note, and her bare feet padded to the middle of the open space before her mirrored vanity in the bedroom door. Ryland needed to be calm and clear to feel the endless current flow through his will. If he could not calm and clear his own mind, then Imreen would do it for him. Before Imreen could begin, her bedroom door opened. Lady Erase, the lifelong handmaiden of the Teker family, peeked her head past the door. Her hair was streaked with silver gray, which she claimed was the stress that Imreen put on her. Her coppery brown eyes found Imreen with stern reclamation.
I heard a sword drawn, and I find you out of bed like a madwoman.
The handmaiden's disapproving scowl deepened, adding defined furrows to her aged wrinkles.
Honestly, out of bed, causing commotion like a child who doesn't know better. My husband needs me, Erase. He is plagued by dreams of the war, leaving him in fearful distress, and I can calm him.
It wasn't a complete lie, but half-truths like these were common from Imreen now.
Erase shook her head and tisked. It's a strange day when a sorcerer needs a noble lady to rescue him.
Imreen concealed a wince as a burning wave of pain cursed inside her. Ryland attempted to shape again, but it hurt him too much.
It is no strange day at all, Lady Erase. Soulless Ryland has saved my life on many occasions. Why would I do less for my husband?
Imreen pointed at the door, shooing her with her free hand.
Now, away with you. Return to your precious sleep. I will be well.
Erase gave Imreen one more worried gaze before she closed the door. Imreen turned to face her window, straightening her posture before bringing the guard of her saber up to eye level. She closed her eyes in the dim candlelight and saw the shadow before Ryland, the torment swimmer. It was a vile thing, accustomed to swimming in lakes of blood, finding it condemned at the surface of this hellish world, and on islands made of writhing, pitiful bodies. It would bury its claws and teeth into its victims and drag them below the surface. Condemned blood was a corrosive acid, so the victims would dissolve and drown repeatedly until there was nothing left. Then, the victims would reform and fall to the surface anew. The swimmers were covered in a protective shell that was highly resistant to the acid. Imreen drew in a long, slow, deep breath. She exhaled twice as slow, moving in a fluid crouch with a low, wide slash. She inhaled slow, as she allowed the cut to follow through and return to its position in front of her face as her posture straightened again. She turned a quarter of a circle to her right and repeated the motion. Her movements were unhurried, following in tandem with her breathing. Her mind gradually released the feelings of pain and anxiety that Ryland transmitted. In return, Imreen's growing calm and single-minded concentration filled back into Ryland.
Imrine felt a little silly and ridiculous performing a soldier's drill in her bedgown, but the effort was worth it. Ryland's mind was clear of worry, and his pain lessened with the infinite vibrations passed into Ryland in a wave, washing over and through like cool, cleansing ocean waters. His determination sharpened, and precision took hold as he shaped the strong winds again. The wind howled in a tempest while Ryland directed his energies into the runes above. Some of these sigils flared with intense white light that hurled the remaining gloom aside. These were the Chronomancer enchantments he learned from the presence of a copy of the last Supreme Magus in his mind. A copied mind of a woman who had been dead for 2 millennia. After a moment, the white etchings spit and showered sparks of crackling golden light. They were instantly caught up in the whirling funnels of air. Ryland aimed his hands at the torment swimmer, and the wind concentrated into a single blasting gale. The light and air sought out the gills on the side of its neck and invaded deep. The growls halted, replaced by graveling cusps and gasps. It shook its glossy black head, trying to clear its breathing. As it failed, it began to slash and shriek. The sound was piercing, and Irene felt Ryland's ears ring for it. Then, the torment swimmer wavered like a mirage and vanished. It screamed, surrendering to the silence. Ryland halted his barrage, while Imrine relaxed her posture. She breathed a weary sigh as she sheathed her saber. They were both tired, losing hours of sleep nearly every night. Usually, Ryland would handle the assaults alone. He bolstered his spirit by helping Solus Borvis with the new construction of New Catan. If he was giving and aiding, his spirit regained some of its potency, and the pull of Negistrisis became less. Imrine snuffed the candle and covered herself in bed. She allowed a moment to feel Ryland's bond with her, drawing his presence as though he lay next to her. She closed her eyes and saw the glowing symbols of Ryland's safe room. Their light reminded her of artfully shaped constellations. She cradled the back of her head with her hands, tangling her fingers in her long, dark brown hair. Imrine sighed wearily. "Can we really continue this alone, my love? You may not need my aid every night, but they keep coming, and more often." What other choice is there? We know execution is more likely to be found than help. Imrine gritted her teeth in frustration. Ryland saved Stratia from complete genocide, and now she was the only help he had. It was true that he saved everyone by becoming their worst fear, but he was selective in the use of those terrible powers. He had no intention of ever using them again. Now the forces of hell were coming to him, trying to regain their champion, and their persistence was without end. At least they send the smallest of their forces, Ryland's thoughts offered, but it was no consolation to her. That is because of their objective, my husband. They are not trying to kill you. They are trying to wear you down. In that regard, their successes are small, but noticeable. Ryland's thoughts answered with a chuckle. Ever the neutral-minded general. Fates, Ryland to care. One of us must be. It was all Imrine could do to keep her voice to an angry hiss. We are pitched in a war with the eternity of hell. If we lose, I lose you. I lose your soul. I cannot fathom your nonchalance in the face of that grim predicament. The image of his wan smile filled her mind. Because you are on my side every day. We fight them together, and that gives me hope. Ryland's conveyed expression brightened further, infectiously. And I look at what the Enlightened Sun does, even now. Every plan they acted upon is a step to making the Order and Stratia stronger than they have been in more than 2,000 years. Imrine allowed her frustration with Ryland to linger a moment longer. Half of his point of optimism had little to do with the spiritual war they were entrenched in. There were times when his desire to cling to hope dangerously overshadowed a needed practical awareness. What she wanted was allies to help them devise better solutions for this. I know I have asked of this many times. Aimrine was cut off by a frequently repeated answer from Rylan. Light Ishel cannot know of this. I simply find it difficult to believe she would not look past her fears and see her best friend who needs aid. Rylan's pained emotions were answer enough. Ishel had already been afraid of the enormity of Rylan's powers once during the war. Her adamant denial to acknowledge the claims of her fellow Stratians that he was a void hand was also unsettling to him. If Ishel could not accept the possibility, how could she be expected to cope with such a horrifying truth with any sort of benevolent mind? It wasn't as though Rylan feared execution for the darkness he unleashed, and Aimrine made it clear that she would gladly die with him. But execution was not as likely as anyone believed. The aspect that was cut off at the rite of separation would view justice through a different lens. As Rylan, more to the point Nedistrissus, was the one who saved their lives, the aspect would take hold. In the moment, he would likely don the full mantle of his destiny. There was every reason to believe he would fulfill the wishes of the long-dead Order of the Void Triangle and end the world. We must endure for a little while more, Rylan's thoughts urged. I will soon depart from Malkanor. As soon as I begin helping with Borquet, my spirit and will should gain greater fortitude. Aimrine's forehead creased with worry. Demons and the Void Triangle were not their only obstacles. Even still, we must move with care, my love, Aimrine cautioned. Many refugees and several of my father's men swear they saw you in the hellfire of the eclipse. Since the return of His Highness, he has begun quickly to grab hold of the rumors and stir their fear. I worry that it is only a matter of time before he twists their fear into anger. Rylan sent an image back to Aimrine of a more like Morinroke as he remembered him. It was a finely dressed boy, consistently scowling, prone to fits of unprovoked violence. Do not lower your guard so, my love. He returned to the palace changed, harder, and far more cunning. Does he abandon the thought of his nullified betrothal? Rylan asked hopefully. Aimrine was betrothed to a Morlock for many years at the insistence of the Queen. Queen Maysel and Morinroke's wrath on the matter was all but an open declaration of war. But the crowned prince who returned after 2 years, and from who knew where, displayed a chilling anger. Aimrine held no regrets for breaking the arrangement with a Morlock. It was made against her will, and her disgust for him was always clear. Ishel and Borvis Len are going to be married in 2 weeks, Rylan informed, offering good tidings against the bleak retrospections. She wishes for us to attend. Aimrine smiled. She remembered the night Ishel led the entire order in a rite to marry Aimrine and Rylan in an unbreakable ritual to unite their souls. It was the reason they shared minds and experiences from so far away and so clearly. At the time, the Order only knew that Rylan was sick and his spirit was dying. They did not know Aimrine bonded to him to help him fight against the pull of Nedistrissus, his dark completed persona. But beyond that, many events brought Aimrine and Ishel closer as friends. They were like sisters to each other. I would not allow it to be otherwise, my love, Aimrine promised. Chapter 5. The snapping backlash of Cassian's titan strand of iron magic stung her hand with a deep, biting cut. Ouch, you don't! Cassian hissed as she sucked the bleeding cut on her fingers. Focus, Larian. That's the 10th instance. Larian rolled her blue, bloodshot eyes before she gripped her tangled, filthy blonde hair and yanked. She whirled to her feet from the cold dirt of the impromptu cave. Her unwashed body shoved a week's worth of stench at Cassian. It was all she could do not to retch at her sister's neglect. Coupled with the coppery reek of blood and barely contained rot, Cassian wished her sense of smell would shut down. Why, sister? Larian screamed, stomping her worn brown wine slippers in a tantrum.
Cassian closed her eyes and drank a deep breath against her growling impatience. She gripped the silken hem of her black skirt in clenched fists and tightened her arms against the gray velvet of her blouse. Honestly, there were times her sister made her want to pull out all her long black hair free from the scalp.
How much longer do we wish to be here, Larian?
Cassian growled between clenched teeth with a condescending smile.
I want out now! I hate this hole in the ground!
Larian shrieked, whirling her yellow-white ragged silk dress in a further tirade.
We are highborn. We are sorceresses. Yet we hide like rats. That is why we must press on. The sooner our attempts yield the progress we need, the sooner we can leave. That is not what they tell us, my dear sister. They tell us to play dead, and here we lie in this grave. Not ours,
Cassian countered, hoping the reminder would calm her. One of the few things they could find plenty of was bodies for their magic. It was useful for Larian's sanguimancy, blood magic, and Cassian's blood iron and toxin magic. Larian paused in her antics to look about at the bodies of the dwellers of the northern wastes. They were only half entombed in the cold dirt for preservation and easier access to their internal fluids. Most of the blood and organs were already extracted. The blood iron was transmuted into support beams that prevented the twins from being buried alive in their hiding hole. The iron also supplied Cassian with a ready, infinite focus for all her magic. But the hideout was not large or luxurious. There were 2 rooms for sleeping, 1 for storage, and the main room for practice and research. A door led to a narrow cylindrical hole that ascended 40 feet with only a rope and ladder for aid. A series of lanterns cast the interior in a dim glow. Larian shrugged.
Her Majesty was generous to give us so many playthings, but I want more. I want new things that aren't so empty.
Cassian countered with a stern warning.
You know why we are here, and why we cannot leave. Yet.
Larian sighed with the boredom of repetition.
The Order believes us dead. Until we can find a way to move about without even Ryland's ever seeing Gaze finding us, we must remain in hiding here, in the Fates' forsaken northern waste.
Cassian attempted to brighten her sister's mood.
At least Rack and Ben return with new playthings from time to time.
Cassian also brought up Amorlic's secret bodyguards in the hopes that mentioning them would garner Larian's focus. Enchanting was hard guesswork as it was. They didn't have tomes of the Order to instruct them in the skill. There was no chance they could sneak and commandeer them either. They only held 2 chances to come out of hiding. The twins could discover a way to enchant an object on their own, or Rack and Ben could return with a corpse that held an item of small enchantment. At this point, Cassian didn't know what was more likely, but she relished the chance to take apart magic with precision she reserved for human bodies. The abundant focus around her proved excellent to fine-tune any spell shape, tailoring it with her untraceable demands. But Larian's madness created a noticeable desire to wander and to explore fresh carnage, hearing new screams from her victims. There was little that could soothe her when she was caged like a wild beast, pacing for a release. But the ruthless cold efficiency of Rakten and Beneath made for an endless source of amusement and fascination for Larian. When all 4 of them were tasked with traveling north into the waste, it was a grueling journey on foot. Meldwalking would only have revealed their presence to the Order and left a trail to follow. The further they traveled from Narrenmoor, the more they encountered brigands and stalking killers. The men that hunted and prowled in the northern wastes saw Larian and Cassian, counting them as 2 easy victims. Just as they could not Meldwalk, They were also forbidden to use their sorcery to defend themselves on the journey. That was swiftly approved by Larian as she watched the quiet mercenaries dispose of their threats. Her bloodshot eyes were wince as her mouth gaped as she watched their blurred dagger whips lash out to inflict great sprays of blood. The mad Sanguomancer would look on in a trance born of admiration. Larian shuddered with a spasm of pleasure most people would find disturbing.
The way they twirl and they snap, and the blood is red and high, like the fountains of Prologue-Chapter.
It was only in such throes of gory ecstasy that Cassian could seize her focus.
I heard the fountains of the capital ran red during the eclipse.
Before the eclipse, Cassian believed there was no limit to the madness and bloodlust of her sister. When it came to void hands and demons, apparently there was a line Larian could not cross. Now, Larian twitches where she quakes of traumatic remembering fear, and her voice cracked with it. She clutched her shoulders in a grip that threatened to break skin.
Blood that splits and breaks. Blood that devours. Screams from beyond. So many screams.
Cassian nodded with faint sympathy.
Powerless as an infant, as we hid in the dark.
Larian whipped around. Another cloud of body odor slammed into Cassian. Her mad twin needed to current cleanse and refresh. Today, or Cassian might cut off her own nose. But Larian did stomp over to the eviscerated corpse and kneel mumbling.
Not powerless. Never powerless again. Never. Never.
Larian shook her head empathetically, lashing her matted, tangled locks. Before they could begin, there was a loud rustle outside before they entered the door. A cold blast of north autumn air accompanied the two men. They were not very tall. The hair curling out of their leather caps was sandy and typical of Odessians. They wore soundless hide and soft leather, as brown as dried dirt from neck to toe. Cassian thought the mercenaries might be a decade older than the twins. They looked like they might be twins themselves, or, at the very least, closely related. The only distinguishing detail was a square patch-like mark below Raktan's neck, and that was seldom seen. At their hips, their daggers were coiled by red and wet with the blood of fresh kills. Beneath carried a strange leather satchel in his left hand, wearing a slight knowing smile on his hard, stumbled face. Cassian eyed the satchel with unveiled interest before giving him a questioning, expectant look.
Judging by your foolish smile and the blood on your weapons, I don't think that's fresh rabbit you bring beneath.
The mercenary's smile widened. He didn't say anything, but they never did. Cassian once thought their tongues were cut out, but they were quick to reveal that that was not correct. Something in their extensive training imposed a level of silence that Cassian and her sister could not break without revealing themselves to the order. Beneath unshouldered the satchel and tossed it on the ground in front of Cassian. She gave the bodyguard one more look before opening the bag. Whatever was inside was important. Rack and Ben left the two women, often for a day or more, to patrol for brigands and miners who came too close to the hideout. Killing these possible intruders was a good way for them to keep their skills polished. Cassian quickly found the hard leather of a book and retrieved it with piqued curiosity. When she opened the book, she was met with elation and frustrated confusion. She leafed through one page after another, while gradually increasing rapidly. There were diagrams and illustrations that hinted at unusual spell shapes and techniques, but the text was a language Cassian didn't recognize. Cassian continued to snap the pages in consternation.
As captivating as this is, I fail to see the purpose in bringing this to us. I have no comprehension of what this is.
Ben knelt on the ground in front of Cassian, unsheathing a throwing dagger and scrawling in the dirt. Kassarin, he wrote. Cassian's hard blue steel eyes snapped up and narrowed at him.
How can you be certain?
Beneath tilted his head, his ordinary brown eyes filled with a wiry sarcasm. He lifted his dagger whip for explanation. Cassian rolled her eyes.
Of course, trained by one. Can you read it?
Beneath pointed at himself and nodded. Then he pointed at Cassian, shook his head, and shrugged. Cassian exhaled loudly with exasperation.
Confound it then. Can you not withhold your silence long enough for a matter of probable importance?
Larian intervened on the rising tension.
There's no need for them to betray their precious vows. Conceal my efforts. I can read the book shortly.
Cassian understood her sister's meaning and quickly pushed her will into the iron beams through a series of air trace sigils. A low hum vibrated along the lengths of the supporting metal. The air warbled with buzzing distortion. As the air sealed with a tangible pressure, Larian retrieved a seamstress needle from the folds of her dress. She grabbed Beneath's free arm at the wrist and pierced his index finger. To Beneath's credit, he didn't flinch or react to the unsanctioned grab or the needle prick. Larian allowed the needle to linger a moment to soak up more blood before she withdrew it. The endless current meandered in a heavy subterranean air, obstructed by Cassian's distortion spell. It took a few moments more for Larian to draw the current she required. Her words were a series of hisses and spits as she traced lines from the needle to her forehead. Larian closed her eyes, and the traced lines began to glow blood red in the air. Particles of the blood departed the needle and floated to her forehead. Larian opened her eyes and gasped in offense. Her eyes were accusing as she looked at Ben.
Truly? We are just a job to you? No fun at all.
Ben shrugged in answer. Larian swore in a lyrical language Cassian didn't understand. She had only ever heard it in anger or urgent shouts 2 years ago.
Quick, read before it wears off.
Cassian thrust the book at Larian. Larian's answer was to forcefully grip Cassian's head in both hands.
You do it! I hate reading!
A flood of knowledge and experiences washed away the world around Cassian before she held the chance to speak. A secondary dialect and written language steeped into her own memories. Regrettably, there was nothing about the silence of the mercenaries. That was an enigma for another day. Cassian effectively borrowed Beneath's aptitude for the Kissaran language. It was time to see if this mystery book held any information that would be useful in their predicament. Cassian leafed through the pages in quick examination. Her eyes widened and she gasped with excitement.
Ben, if my sister were not so haggard, I would have her kiss you for me.
That earned an offended look from Larian, which Cassian promptly ignored.
Fates! This is a study journal from an enchanter's guide.
Cassian only held the knowledge of Kissaran society through the borrowed knowledge from Ben.
It should not even be instruct here. The owner must have been fleeing to defect when the eclipse occurred. They probably disguised themselves as a havoc magi and left their guild's entire empire.
Larian's expression was flat brown.
All very enticing. And it also does nothing for us.
Cassian answered with an uncharacteristic grin.
Except that there's detailed instructions on enchanting. There's mention of studies that resulted in our loss of power just before the final Kissaran's all-out assault. Along with a way to get out of here, we had the beginnings of a study that could change the shape of Provis forever.
Larian looked equally dumbstruck and ecstatic, even as Cassian continued to press into the journal with giddy fervor. The Kissaran Empire only viewed the discovery of closing away the endless current from their enemies. The fools never realized how close they were in redefining the worth and necessity of every life in Provis.